Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about the Mongol Empire, which was built by Genghis Khan. He started out as a kidnapped orphan with trust issues, but he ended up as the leader of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's start getting ready for tonight's journey together. First, let's turn the lights down a bit and maybe turn on a fan to make it feel more comfortable. You have just woken up near the Onon River. You're wrapped in wool that smells like a damp yak. It is still dark outside, and you are disorientated. There's frost on your boots, a thin layer of ice in your nose, and the sound of something snorting far too close to your head. It's your horse. Of course it is. He's your bedmate, your ride, your heating system, and sometimes your lunch. Here, personal space doesn't exist. He breathes heavily on you and steps on your coat while you try to stand up. He doesn't say sorry. Mongol horses never apologize. Your camp is already in motion. No one says anything. They just mount up and ride off like smoke. A boy with a bow the length of his body gallops past you, yawning. He looks about 10. His saddle is older than he is. He has been riding for longer than you have been alive. You fasten your sash, gather your things, and climb onto your horse. There is no special ceremony to mark the start of the journey. No one says a big thank you, and no one has breakfast. You eat dried meat while riding. If your jaw isn't strong yet, it will be by tomorrow. If there is a tomorrow, the wind will blow from the side. It's not wind for decoration. It's the kind that criticizes people who are not prepared. You're riding into it at full speed. Your face goes numb by the third ridge. No one notices. Nobody asks if you're okay. This is the steppe. You are either riding or you are part of the landscape. By midday, you've changed horses twice. It's not because you're tired. The horses, you're expected to be harder than your animal. If the horse is struggling, you carry more. This is what we call balance. You urinate from horseback. You eat from horseback. You fight on horseback. If you fall off, you will be trampled. If you stop moving, you will be left. If you complain, they won't listen. They'll just assume the wolves got you early. You ride because everyone rides. There are no roads, no destinations, only speed and survival. In the Mongol Empire, prisoners were made to walk. And you're not a prisoner yet. You made it through. You're not dead. That's good. But now you're hungry, which is a shame because breakfast here isn't a meal. It's a dare. Someone hands you a leather bag. It sloshes around. That's your morning drink. Fermented mare's milk. It's white, sour, slightly fizzy, and smells like a saddle that's been through 3 weeks of riding through war zones. You drink it anyway, not because you want to, but because there is no other option. It's called Eric. It contains alcohol, but not the kind you might expect. It reminds you that bacteria are real and live in your throat. Now, children in Mongolia drink this. Warriors do too. Grandmothers are the same. If it burns as it goes down, that's how you know it's working. Food. There might be a piece of dried meat. Maybe it's gray, wrinkly, and so tough you could use it to fix your boots. You chew it for 20 minutes, but it doesn't get any smaller. It just gets wetter. There's also some curd, a rock-hard, dried-out dairy lump that could be used as a projectile weapon. It tastes like sour dust, feels like gravel, and makes your teeth hurt. You think about crying, but you can't make yourself cry. You sit on the ground because there are no tables, chairs, or napkins, just wind, wool, and the distinct scent of someone boiling something with hooves in it. There are no forks or spoons, just your hands and the silent judgment of the old man opposite you, who has already finished his meal, tied a new knot in his saddle rope, and is now sharpening a blade with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious experiences. You eat what you're given. You don't ask what it is. That's a good way to stop being given food. There is no chatting. Mongols don't waste time with small talk before or after a battle or during meals. They eat like they ride. It is fast, quiet, and ready to move at any moment. You try to match their pace. You fail. The sheep fight back. You're not full. You're not satisfied, but you're slightly less hungry. And in the Mongol Empire, that's a win. It's mid-morning. The horses are sweating. So are you. You may be wondering, when do you wash it? You don't. In the Mongol Empire, cleanliness was not about using soap or taking baths. The most important thing is not to die from an infection. And even that price could be discussed. You smell like leather, horse, meat smoke, and the faint sourness of your boots. Everyone else does the same. No one says anything. If you arrive smelling of flowers, you're either a spy or cursed. Maybe both. Water is for drinking, not bathing. Do you want to wash yourself with river water? That's drinking water. Do you want to die of dissenting? Go for it. If not, just wipe your face with your sleeve and move on. There is no soap. It contains animal fat. There is ash. There is sand. If you want to exfoliate, rub your face with a handful of dust and pretend it's a spa. Your hands are very dirty. Your nails are weapons. Your hair hasn't seen water in months, but it's tied neatly under your cap because you care about how you look, even if that means you're not getting the cleanest hair. That's fair. You can't just get rid of lice. You're in charge of them. You name them. You throw them into the fire while you're chatting in the evening. If they bite too much, you smear yourself with animal fat and dare them to keep going. Clothing. It's made of wool. It's stiff. It's been worn for 3 winters and still has blood on it from a goat you vaguely remember arguing with. You don't change it. You layer it. Add more during the winter months. Peel it off in summer. Maybe underwear doesn't exist. Shame doesn't help either. And your teeth are your own problem. You don't need to use brushes or rinse. You chew bones. You drink air. You idiot. You hope that the acidity of your breakfast slowly dissolves whatever is stuck between your teeth. You should always have a knife ready to use. This is for when you have a tooth problem, not for when you have enemies. So no, you don't get a bath. You get wind. You get horse sweat. You get a strong smell of people's natural bodies. But there's a bright side. You won't be able to smell anyone else over you. Now that you've forgotten everything you knew about hygiene, it's time to get ready for your first fight. You ride all morning and into the afternoon. You don't know where you're going. You're just going. Then you see them, a group of moving dots on the horizon. Riders like you, but not like you. They're not here to share stories and fermented milk. They're here to die or make you die. It's easy to use. Don't panic. No one panics. Everyone just reaches for their bow. Mongol bows are short and curved. They're deadly and heavier than they look. They're made from layers of horn, sinew, and raw intent. They don't forgive mistakes. They don't miss twice. You make a notch in your arrow. Your horse keeps moving. You don't slow down. That would be embarrassing. You twist your waist, lean into the wind, and let go. It flies. So does theirs. Welcome to Mongol warfare. There are no exciting sword fights or fancy jewelry, just arrows. He fired arrows at me all the time. They were clever and not romantic. He fired them from impossible distances while galloping. You've hardly had time to react, and 3 of your enemies are already on the ground. 2 more are going the wrong way, and they might be thinking about changing their whole way of life. The secret is movement. They're always on the move. The enemy gets closer. You retreat, not because you're scared, but because you've made a conscious choice to do so. The famous faux retreat. Let them think you're running. Let them chase. Then turn around and shoot them in the face. You're part of a dance. Fast, precise, and brutal. There's no shouting or yelling. Just the sound of bowstrings being pulled and the dull thud of arrows hitting their targets. You hear a scream. It's short. You don't look back. Your arrows are not just sharp. They're poisoned. It's not personal. It's practical. Kill one enemy and let his friends waste time taking him away. If you wound 2, you've stopped them from moving. Being efficient is more important than being honorable. You've now fired about 50 arrows. You've lost count. That's okay. There's a bag of 70 more hanging from your saddle. You keep shooting until your fingers hurt. Then keep shooting because if you stop, you won't have fingers left. By sunset, the battle is over. You don't know how many you killed. No one does. No one's counting. Only one thing matters. You're still riding. You don't celebrate. You wipe your blade. You eat. You sleep. And you will ride again tomorrow. The battle is over. The sun goes down behind the hills. There was no singing or parades, just a crackling fire and the quiet sound of something being cut up nearby. It's time for dinner. You're expected to eat what you kill. If you didn't kill anything today, don't worry. Someone did. All you have to do is help prepare it. This means cutting the skin off, cutting it into slices, or sometimes stabbing it again because it's still moving a bit. The meat is tough. Of course it is. It's from an animal that spent its whole life walking uphill in a snowstorm. You cook it on an iron spit that has been in your family for a very long time. There are no spices, salt, or ceremony. If it bleeds less than you, it's ready. You sit in a circle and chew quietly. Everyone stares into the fire as if they owe it money. A warrior next to you eats the bone clean, as if it could grow into another goat. The fat is the best part. It's greasy, rich, and absolutely essential to staying alive. Mongols prize fat above all, not for its taste, but because it keeps you warm at night. You don't question it. You bite into it as if it has wronged your ancestors. There's no bread, no vegetables, just meat and dairy, and something in a wooden bowl that might be soup or might be regret. If someone gives you a piece of meat, you eat it. You eat it. You don't ask what it was like to be alive. Curiosity is a luxury. You're not a noble. You're not a guest. You're like a stomach with legs and a knife. After eating, there is no need to clean up. The bones go to the dogs, the ashes to the wind. You wipe your hands on your cloak, which also works as a napkin, towel, and winter blanket. Hygiene is still just a theory. Someone belches. This is considered polite. You do it too. Well done. You're getting used to things. Later, when you're snuggled up in your warm bedroll next to a horse snoring away, you'll be dreaming of meat because tomorrow is full of opportunities too. If it doesn't, you'll have to ride further until it does. There's no announcement and no snowflakes drifting poetically from the sky. One night you're sleeping with your boots off. When your boots are frozen solid, you will also feel like you have no energy left. Welcome to winter on the steppe. It doesn't get cold, it becomes cold. A cold that feels like it's right under your skin and makes you feel like you're not meant to be here. The wind doesn't howl. It really hurts. It has teeth that are sharp and point at your ears. Your breath becomes foggy. First you get the ice, then you feel bad about it. You sleep with your horse now. Don't get too close to your horse. With your horse, you press your back against its side as if it were a lover made of hay and muscle. You might think it's a bit strange, but at least it's warm. Clothing becomes a game of layers. The material is made up of layers of wool, leather, and fur. You stop feeling your fingers by mid-morning. You will not feel your toes the day after. You try not to think about it. If they come back, that's great. If not, there will be fewer things to stub. There is no wood for a fire, no trees, just frozen animal poo. You burn it without question. It smells like betrayal, but it's just the heat. The smoke curls around your face and makes your eyes water. You blink, but your eyelashes freeze together. You are now part sculpture. You're water ice. Your food is ready. Your nose is bleeding. You still ride. Mongols don't let the weather stop them. If it's not an arrow or a plague, it's not important. You ride with snow in your boots and feel the wind on your face. And nobody cares. This is especially true for the horses who seem to enjoy it. The cold changes you. It takes your voice, dries your skin, and makes you more quiet, stiff, and less optimistic. You stop complaining, not because you're being stubborn, but because you can't move your jaw. But you keep going. If you stop, you'll freeze. And if you freeze, someone will bury you under a can of stones and ride off without stopping. The Empire doesn't wait for spring. You don't either. He doesn't look like a legend. He sits cross-legged on a plain wooden platform, chewing a piece of dried meat as if he is a bored butcher. His coat is worn and dirty from the weather. His beard is uneven. His boots have blood on them, but it's not clear where it came from. This is your Khan, your general, your leader, the man who can order entire cities to be wiped from the map with a raised eyebrow. You should only speak if someone speaks to you first. You don't look into someone's eyes for too long. You should never correct someone's pronunciation, even if they keep calling you that same name for 6 months. He speaks gently. Mongolian leaders don't shout. If you can't hear him, that's your problem. Pay more attention to the sound of your own heartbeat, because it's now louder than his voice. Orders are short, precise, and absolute. Come on over. Burn this. Accept the tribute. Kill the messenger. Don't come back until it's finished. You nod. Everyone nods their heads in agreement, even the tough ones. The warriors who once ran away from a battle are now nervous and shaky, like school children. One man coughs during the meeting. He is now gone. No one mentions him again. Your Khan doesn't care about your feelings. He is focused on getting results. Did the city fall? Did you bring back the tribute? Is the caravan moving? Are the horses fed? If you can't do any of these things, you'd better be holding your severed arm as an excuse. His tent is simple, but it has maps. There are so many maps, all of which are hand-drawn and annotated in a scroll that looks like a falcon has learned calligraphy. You don't understand any of it. He understands all of it. He sees rivers as roads, mountains as small problems, and kingdoms as small prizes wrapped in bad diplomacy. You get your orders. You leave. You never ask questions. You do not stay long. You get your horse ready for the ride and go out into the cold. In the Mongol Empire, leadership was not about charisma. It's about survival. People who doubt the Khan usually only get one chance to do so. You ride into a place you don't know carrying a message. You're not a soldier today. You are an ambassador. This doesn't mean you're safe. You ride with a small group of people, a flag to show that you want to make peace, and the confident feeling that you have thousands of warriors behind you who will destroy an entire civilization if your letter is not well received. The letter itself is simple and direct, written in a few short lines in Mongolian, Persian, or Chinese, depending on who is receiving it. It says, "Give us your money or don't. We'll be back either way." It's sealed with the Khan's mark, a bit of hardened wax that might as well be soaked in gasoline, considering what follows a refusal. You ride into cities with marble gates, golden domes, silk curtains, and nervous guards. You are full. You are questioned. You are stared at like a hungry wolf that's somehow been invited to dinner. You are polite. You are calm. You explain slowly that it is better for everyone if they submit. Protection from the Mongols has its advantages: trade, order, and slightly fewer massacres. If you don't, they will come at you with fire, arrows, and will destroy anything that looks like a building. Sometimes they say yes. They offer tribute, horses, gold, and daughters. You nod, you leave, you report back. That city is still standing. Sometimes they hesitate. They talk in secret. They give you vague answers and suspiciously generous gifts. You accept them. You smile. You take notes. And sometimes they kill the person who delivers the message. This is bad for them. You cannot get revenge by complaining. You get your revenge using siege engines, horse archers, psychological warfare, and even severed heads as warning signs. The Mongol Empire is a very modern place. One message, one chance, no more letters, no hidden messages. You do what the Khan want. If you ignore him, he'll come back with 40,000 mounted archers and a few engineers who are really excited about it. You don't argue. You don't negotiate. You get the job done. If the world listens, it lives. You've arrived in what is basically the capital of Mongolia. You're expecting to maybe get walls. It's a palace with shiny floors, and there's a guy in a hat selling figs. Instead, you'll find a swarm of yurts, felt domes, and more. They appear across the plains like mushrooms after rain. There are no stones or marbles, just wool, smoke, and the smell of something boiled. This is Karakorum, the capital city, the center of an empire that stretches from the Korean peninsula to the edge of Europe. It looks like someone lost a sheep, but don't be fooled, it works. Yurts aren't huts, they're like mobile command centers. You can take them down in an hour and rebuild them by nightfall. You can set a city on fire. You can't burn something that's already gone by morning. The Kun's yurt is bigger than the others. Its doorway faces south. This is always true. You can't just go in. Inside, there's felt, furs, scrolls, and a throne that looks less like a place to rule and more like a sturdy place to survive a siege of guests. People come here from all over the empire. Traders from Baghdad, princes from Kiev, and spies from the Song dynasty are all sitting cross-legged, drinking maize milk and not paying any attention to the woman in the corner who has just used a spoon to take the meat off a deer. There's no bureaucracy like you find in some other countries, and no big offices full of people writing reports. There's just a man with a very good memory and a few assistants who write things down using bone styluses and are a bit scared. The law is spoken. Decrees are sent out on horseback. Paper is valuable. Ink is expensive. Mistakes can be very serious. And yet the streets are clean. The roads are safe. The trade routes are like blood vessels. There's no poverty because there's no room for it. You're either useful or you're on a horse somewhere being made useful. This isn't Rome. This isn't Baghdad. This is the Mongolian answer to city life. It's mobile, brutal, and efficient. There are no tall buildings or statues. It was just felt, fire, and the knowledge that the whole city could disappear by sunrise and reappear 5 valleys away like it was never there at all. You steal a horse. You're hungry. You're cold. It looks like it's been left alone. You think you'll just do a short ride, maybe 2 or 3 miles. You'll probably bring it back. They catch you before you reach the tree line. Now you're on your knees in front of a man with a mustache so sharp it might count as a weapon. He's not angry. He's not shouting. He's just pointing at the horse, then at you, then at a nearby rock. Is flat, broad, and ready to be put into action. You're about to learn something important. There are no jails, no appeals, and number 16 step legal process. In the Mongol Empire, justice comes in 2 forms: repayment or removal. If you steal, you must give back twice as much as you took. If you can't, something else will be taken. You might use a finger, a hand, or sometimes even your head, depending on how you're feeling and how valuable the thing you're trying to steal is. You give your side of the story in a short amount of time. Mongols believe in clarity. If you talk for too long, they will think you are lying. You shorten your explanation to 3 words and hope they count as a character reference. The elders discuss. One of them spits. Another one shrugs. Then they nod. Verdict: you live. Sentence: you walk. You don't ride anymore. The horse is gone. You will now follow the caravan on foot until your honor is considered untarnished, which may take a season or several. No one has said how long this will take. Mongols aren't sentimental about rehabilitation. You either get punished or you don't. After that, they expect you to keep up. Murder is a crime that can be punished by death. However, if it was a justified blood feud, you would have to pay the family livestock, labor, or a wife for all 3. You would also have to lie to your commander, killing a member of the Mongol people, killing a person from another country who is being protected. The person dies twice, with a funeral service to celebrate their life. On the other hand, people really value honesty, courage, generosity, and respect. Even if you stink and ride like a sack of potatoes, if you speak the truth and keep your word, people will feed you. Mongolian law is strict, but it's quick, consistent, and you can't bribe it. You know where you stand, usually in front of someone with a sword, and if you have done nothing wrong, you are mostly free of guilt. The scouts are back. No one says anything. They just nod towards the west, where smoke rises like a promise. It's a city with walls and fortifications. It's the kind of place that thinks its gates and guards are important. That's really sweet. You set off at sunrise. Behind you, there are engineers with trolleys full of surprises. We have ropes, axes, fire pits, and collapsible siege equipment. This is the Mongolian version of party favors. There is no big speech, no blessing, and no drum roll. With just a few hand signals and the quiet noise of 5,000 men reaching for their bows, the scene is set. First, you circle. Always circle. You'll see what happens. You notice when something is wrong. The tower is crooked, the gate is in the wrong place, and part of the wall looks as though it has seen better days. You tell your captain what you have seen, who makes a noise and scratches something into the dirt with a dagger. Then the noise starts. There are screams, horns, and fire. You don't go straight in. You wait. Let panic do the work. Let the citizens argue over whether to hide the gold or bury the children. If they hesitate, your engineers get closer with their ladders and catapults. Walls are not a problem. Mongols build siege towers on site, using materials from the landscape. Trees, rocks, and some furniture from a monastery that was recently evacuated. You don't need to carry equipment, you just need to feel confident. The archers create a storm. It's not a volley, it's a weather system. Arrows make the sky black and fall down slowly. Then you get on the bike. You hit the gate, not with a hammer, but with the force of wind. You rush through the breach, with your swords out and horses foaming at the mouth. Your eyes are narrowed, but not because you're angry. You're thinking carefully. This is not madness. This is maths. If you clear an alley, you will get closer to the granary. Every time you reach a new corner, it's a matter of planning and logistics. You don't go looting for greed. You got to find supplies. And when it's finished, when the towers fall and the banners are pulled down, you don't gloat. You inventory. Who gave up? Who was against it? Who is useful? Who is the decorative element? The rest of the people leave quickly and efficiently. By the time it gets dark, the city is full of Mongols. You're already planning to leave tomorrow. The banners are up. The bodies are down. The city is quiet now. The quiet that follows when everyone realizes who's in charge. You, the winner. You, the horse, breathed in the air outside and was involved in a siege engine this morning. Now you're reviewing tax codes over goat stew. That's just how it works. In the Mongol Empire, conquering a territory was not the ultimate goal. It's the onboarding phase. The locals look out from their broken windows and damaged temples, expecting the usual: theft, destruction, and decades of anger. Instead, they meet a man in a fur coat holding a list of different jobs. The Mongols don't destroy everything. They only destroy things that resist. The rest of the catalog has been listed. If you're a blacksmith, you can stay. If you're a weaver, it's the same. If you're a scholar, congratulations. You now work for a man who has never read a book, but he knows exactly how many arrows it takes to erase a library. There is no official government. You and a few other writers, plus a lot of common sense from the Mongols. You choose officials who should ideally be locals who understand the language and know how to avoid being attacked when collecting taxes. The laws are simple. Obey the Kei-chen. Pay what you owe. Don't cause trouble. If that sounds vague, don't worry. The law is very clear. One warning, then it's time to use the rope. Trade routes will be open again by 12 o'clock. Toll stations have people working at them in the evening, and the market is already selling roasted fish like nothing happened, because business is the empire's second most important thing after horses. You shouldn't force your culture on other people. You don't build statues. All you have to do is make sure the grain is counted and the caravans leave on time. The Mongol rule is not about identity. It's about being efficient. You can keep your temples and your customs, just not your rebellious behavior. Attacks are levied. Census takers arrive. By the end of the week, the people who were complaining yesterday are now happy that the roads are safer. You beat them, yes, but you also made delivery times better. You're riding west now, further west than you've ever gone. Leave behind the familiar grasslands, the cities you helped destroy, and even the yurts with their familiar insults carved into them. This is the frontier, the edge of the empire where the air is thin and there are a lot of rumors. You won't get any instructions. Directions are for people with roads. What you get are gestures. A gesture towards a mountain, a wave past a valley of smoke, and the ever-present Mongol compass. Follow the bones. Out here, you see things that the empire hasn't yet decided whether to acknowledge. Strange stone towers, half-built forts left behind, trees with ribbons tied around them, gifts for gods who don't reply to letters anymore. You pass a monastery with its doors ripped off. There is incense inside, and it is very quiet. A monk bows to you, offers you tea, and doesn't get upset when you track mud across his sacred floor. He has seen people like you before. He knows what happens when someone says no. Then people started to talk about ghost armies, cities that disappeared overnight, and a mountain pass where a Khan's brother vanished and came back 2 years later smiling and never blinking again. You don't believe most of it, but you go slower anyway. At night, you camp in silence. There are no fires, no laughter, just you, your horse, and the sound of wolves having religious discussions nearby. You wrap your cloak tightly and check your sword twice, not because of bandits, but because of stories that start with, "No one who rides this way, not even your horse, feels comfortable. It wins its shadows." This is a horse that has eaten human flesh and run away when there was thunder. The edge of the empire isn't marked by fences. It's marked by atmosphere, a weakening of control, and a widening of logic. Out here, the Khan's word arrives late and often as a whisper. But your orders are clear. Scout, observe, return. You do all three things in that order. You notice every strange village, every temple that is only half finished, and every field where the grass grows sideways. And when you turn back towards civilization, you feel the empire behind you. Heavy, brutal, real. The edge didn't swallow you this time. You've come back, not exactly in style, but alive, which in Mongol terms is like being a saint. Your horse is thinner. Your boots are covered in blood. You have fewer teeth, but your scroll pouch is full. It contains names, maps, and tallies of tribute, as well as the occasional sketch of a fortress that looked at you strangely. You hand it over. The rider nods. A commander grunts. The empire is still going strong. And one day, somewhere far away, in a quiet European library or a busy Chinese court, someone will open an old scroll and frown when they see your name. They will not pronounce it correctly. They won't understand the shortened words. They will look at the numbers you counted with frozen fingers after 3 days without sleep and say, "These must be exaggerated." History can be strange like that. It calms it down. Historians are worried about the Mongol Empire. They will call you barbarians, savages, and a horde. They will see you as a group of people who have no trade routes, no diplomats, and no legal system. They will see you as a group of people who are violent and who act without thinking. People will forget about engineers, the postal service, and religious tolerance. They'll remember the sieges. Who wouldn't? But not the fact that you asked cities to give up before destroying them. You offered peace, order, and lower toll fees. They'll paint your face twisted in rage, but they'll never show the months you spent negotiating over water rights with a man who bathed once per decade. They will turn your sensible leadership into chaos, your strict discipline into madness, and your efficient conquest into random destruction. And they'll conveniently ignore the part where their own kingdoms fell apart from within long before you showed up with a torch and a plan. But you don't care because you weren't trying to leave a legacy. You were building real roads. You were making empires answer for their walls. You were making the world smaller, one step at a time. If people only remember you as a shadow from the east, that's okay. No one knows exactly where Charlemagne was born, just like no one knows what a monk's tax records look like. Some people say he was born in Hurst. Others argue for Aachen or Ingelheim. The truth is, in the middle of the 8th century, nobody cared about birth certificates, especially not for future emperors. We do know this. In the year 742, a boy was born to Pepin the Short and Petrado of Lion. That boy would go on to shape medieval Europe. Pepin was not an ordinary Frankish noble. He had recently done one of the smartest political things of the time. He overthrew the Merovingian puppet king Childrich III and got the Pope's blessing to crown himself king of the Franks. This means that the new baby, who was called Charlemagne, was born into a powerful family, but also into a family that had just come up with a new idea about how to rule. Charlemagne's early childhood was not like the story of a boy who chases frogs in a meadow. He was being prepared, prepped for war, rule, and religion, sometimes all at once. Frankish education wasn't like poetry and philosophy. It was all about swords, prayer, and how to deal with unruly nobles who might try to stab you in your sleep. His tutor, who might have been a man named Fulrad, was not much for storytelling before bedtime. He was more into reciting Latin prayers or getting into trouble. We don't know much about young Charlemagne's personality. He didn't keep a diary, and the writer of his biography, Einhard, wrote about him like a teenage fan writing about their celebrity crush. But one thing is clear. Even when he was young, Charlemagne was different. He was over 6 feet tall, which is impressive in an age when 5 feet was considered tall. He was a natural leader, taking to it with ease. By the time his father died in 768, Charlemagne was ready to take over the kingdom. Well, half of it. The kingdom was split between him and his brother Carlin, just like in medieval times. Sharing power is never a good idea in monarchies or at family dinners. So naturally, things started to get tense. But for now, Charlemagne was the official king. Young, ambitious, and already looking to a Europe that had not been united since Roman times. He was wearing a crown. He had a sword in his hand. In Europe was about to meet its new architect. Charlemagne's first problem as king was not a foreign invasion or a nobleman who was against him. It was Carlin, his younger brother, the other guy with the crown. Pepin the Short, being wise, split the Frankish kingdom in half. He gave Charlemagne the western part and Carloman the eastern part. The plan was for this to be a peaceful joint project. In reality, it was a disaster involving swords, and people were passive-aggressive. The brothers were not friends. Their territories were technically allied, but their courts were like rival war camps. Carloman was suspicious, proud, and quite possibly just plain difficult. Charlemagne, on the other hand, was already showing signs of being a ruthless strategist. He wasn't going to let his younger brother stop him from achieving his goals. Things got worse over small disagreements and political maneuvering. One important moment was when Charlemagne was asked to help put an end to a revolt in Aquitaine. Instead of working together, Carloman refused to send troops. This is what a big brother would do. Relax. Let your older brother do all the fighting, then be upset when he gets the credit for it. Desiderius, the king of the Lombards in northern Italy, walked into this difficult situation. He offered Charlemagne a marriage alliance, his daughter, in exchange for peace and cooperation. Charlemagne, who always took advantage of opportunities, agreed and married her. Carloman, he saw this as a betrayal. Decidius had once supported their father, and now Charlemagne was getting close to him. The situation was like a medieval soap opera. And just as things were about to get really bad, Carlin died at the right moment. In 771, just 3 years after they started ruling together, Carlin suddenly died at the age of 20. According to the official sources, the cause of death was natural. In medieval times, this could mean anything from pneumonia to being looked at the wrong way. Charlemagne wasted no time. He moved into his brother's territory as if he had been planning it since the beginning. Carlin's wife and children ran away. Who did they run away from? Decidius, who was now very angry. Charlemagne was now the ruler of all France. There will be no more brothers, no more cooking, just one man, one crown, and a growing list of enemies. And next on that list, the in-laws. Now that Carloman was out of the picture, Charlemagne had a kingdom to himself. But he had a problem in Italy, specifically Decidius, the king of the Lombards. You know, the guy whose daughter Charlemagne had married and then very quietly divorced the moment Carlin died. It's awkward. Desiderius was not happy. To make matters worse, he had taken in Carlin's widow and sons and was now openly supporting their claim to Charlemagne's throne. This is not just annoying in medieval politics. That's basically like declaring war. Charlemagne didn't hesitate. In 773, he led his army across the Alps. And no, this wasn't a summer walk through the mountains. Crossing the Alps meant snow, narrow mountain passes, and the occasional unexpected avalanche. But Charlemagne did it anyway, because he was determined and didn't let anything stop him. When he got to Italy, Charlemagne attacked Pavia, the capital of the Lombards. Decidius was determined to keep going. Unfortunately for him, Charlemagne was very patient while copying the Bible. He surrounded the city and waited. Months went by. There were fewer and fewer supplies. Everyone's morale, the mood of the soldiers, dropped quickly. By 774, Pavia had surrendered. Charlemagne didn't just win one war. He took the Lombard crown for himself. That's right. He didn't install a puppet ruler or get along with the local nobility. He just said he was the king of the Lombards. This made him ruler of both the Franks and the Lombards. This was a very bold move by a medieval ruler, and it was so important that it was heard all the way in Rome. Speaking of Rome, the Pope Adrian, I have been nervously watching all of this from the Vatican like a bishop holding his breath during a chess match. Desiderius had already attacked the Papal States before, and the Pope had hoped Charlemagne would save him. Charlemagne did, and in return he received the Pope's blessing and an alliance with the Church that would last for decades. The Lombard campaign wasn't just a family feud that turned into a war. It was a statement. Charlemagne wasn't following the old tribal rules anymore. He was building an empire, and now he had God's support, which made it a lot harder for anyone to say no to him. With Italy under control and the Pope on their side, Charlemagne looked north towards the Saxons. These weren't rich and powerful nobles enjoying wine. These tribes were pagans. They were wild, warlike, and hated Christianity. For years, they had been attacking the borders of the Frankish Empire, raiding villages and disrespecting everything holy. Charlemagne had had enough. In 772, he started a campaign that would become his most infamous, the Saxon Wars. Not just one war, but 18 separate campaigns spread over 30 years. The Saxons, who lived in the forest, did not give up. At first, it went well. Charlemagne invaded Saxony, set fire to the sacred tree, and told everyone, "Now we're going to be Christian." The Saxons reacted in the way that any proud warrior people would. They smiled politely and said, "Sure, no problem." And then he immediately started a rebellion as soon as his army left. This happened again and again. Charlemagne would march in, defeat any resistance, baptize a few thousand frightened locals at sore point, and leave. Then the Saxons would torture the church, kill the priests, and go back to worshiping their old gods. The most famous moment was in 782 after a big rebellion. Charlemagne ordered the massacre of Verdun, killing around 4,500 Saxons in a single day. It was really cruel, even for the medieval times. It sent a message. Conversion was not optional. It was compulsory. Charlemagne wasn't just looking for people to obey him. He wanted people to obey him because he was a spiritual leader. He really thought it was his Christian duty to save people, even if that meant using fire and weapons. Monks followed his armies. Churches were built as quickly as fortresses. And what about Saxons who refused to be baptized? Well, let's just say the baptismal font came with backup swords. But even after all this effort, the Saxons just wouldn't stay conquered. The forests of northern Germany became a graveyard for Frankish soldiers and a test of Charlemagne's patience. The war continued year after year, with one revolt after another. Charlemagne wasn't just a soldier who fought with a sword. He also really liked books. Yes, this man, who spent decades forcing Saxons to convert to Christianity, also started one of Europe's most important educational movements. Welcome to the Carolean Renaissance, a movement that focused more on making sure monks knew how to spell than on oil painting. Charlemagne had a problem. His empire was growing really quickly and getting harder to govern. The priests, nobles, and officials he trusted with the job were, to put it bluntly, pretty much illiterate. The way the government was run was like a game of medieval telephone, and even the Bible was being interpreted in a creative way. So, Charlemagne did something really big. He said that education was important. He invited the best scholars in Europe to his court. The most important of these was Alcuin of York, a practical Anglo-Saxon intellectual who probably thought bad Latin was as frustrating as modern editors find Comic Sans. Alcuin helped Charlemagne to set up schools at the palace, decide what should be taught, and make monasteries also used as schools. And this wasn't just for nobles. Charlemagne wanted everyone, including priests, scribes, and even ordinary people, to have the chance to learn how to read and write. This was in Latin, the language of the church, because what's the point of being educated if you can't read the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible? It's interesting that Charlemagne, who was very committed to education, himself had little education. He could speak several languages, but he tried to learn reading and writing too. There are stories of him keeping wax tablets under his pillow to practice writing at night. But ruling an empire didn't leave much time for writing. But Charlemagne showed the way. He really liked knowledge. He respected scholars. He even made handwriting the same for everyone. Yes, Carolean minuscule, that clean, readable font that modern fonts still copy, was his creation. Before, manuscripts were a mess because the ink was coming out all over the place. He worked hard to make sure that thousands of old books were kept safe. Monks started copying manuscripts like their lives depended on it, because sometimes they did. More people can read and write. The church became more coherent, and Europe took a small step towards the modern world. It was Christmas Day in the year 800 AD. The streets of Rome were cold, the churches were full of people, and Charlemagne was attending church like a good Christian king. Or at least that's what everyone thought, until Pope Leo III did something that no one saw coming. As Charlemagne prayed, the Pope suddenly placed a golden crown on his head and named him Emperor of the Romans. It was a sudden change with no warning, no formal ceremony, and no polite invitation to be emperor. No, it's like building an empire overnight. Historians still can't agree on whether Charlemagne knew this was going to happen. Some people say it was staged, while others say it caught him by surprise. Charlemagne later said that he would never have gone into the church if he had known. This is the kind of thing a king would say. Either way, the symbolism was huge. The Roman Empire fell in 476. Now, over 300 years later, the Pope was effectively bringing it back to life with Charlemagne as its new leader. a Frankish king, chosen by the church, ruled over a group of Germanic tribes, Lombards, and Latin-speaking religious leaders. The Holy Roman Empire was born. Although that name wouldn't be used for a while, this moment changed everything. Charlemagne was also a religious leader. It was spiritual and divine. He was seen as the new leader of the Caesars, a Christian emperor with the Pope as his ally and spiritual guide. But not everyone was happy. The Byzantine Empire in Constantinople had been calling itself Roman Emperor for centuries and did not like the Frankish ruler in the West calling himself Emperor too. For a very long time, relations between countries were difficult. People used titles like insults and signed treaties when they felt they had no choice. But when they got back home, they kept the title. Charlemagne was emperor until he died in 814, and the power of the emperor made everything he did important, from making laws to changing the church. This was the final part of his rule, a crown made not just of gold, but of legitimacy, myth, and historical theater. It was impressive to conquer half of Europe. The plan is to keep the peace and stop things from getting out of control. That's the real magic trick. Charlemagne is an interesting example of this. He achieved his goals not just through fighting, but also through writing, messengers, monks, and a kind of medieval spreadsheet system. After he became emperor, Charlemagne started to take his role seriously. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once. He started building a system that looked a lot like an early version of modern bureaucracy, just with more Latin and slightly fewer bribes. At the center of his government were the missi dominici, literally the Lord's envoys. These were trusted officials, always sent in pairs, usually one noble and one bishop. They traveled around the empire, delivering royal orders, inspecting local lords, and making sure no one was secretly building their own little kingdom in the backwoods. Imagine they're like medieval auditors, but with swords and backed by divine power. Local counts and dukes still ruled their regions, but they had to answer to Charlemagne. And if they didn't, well, a friendly visit from a Mrs. Dominicus could quickly turn into a career-ending conversation. Charlemagne was very strict when it came to people who were disloyal. He also introduced written laws and instructions that applied across the empire. These covered everything from how to run a monastery to how many soldiers and noble had to provide to what kind of bread should be served at imperial banquets. Yes, even bread is subject to regulation, because you can't have an empire falling apart over badly baked loaves. But this wasn't just about micromanagement for its own sake. Charlemagne believed in order and believed that a stable, well-run empire was a sign of God's favor. His laws were not just legal, they were moral too. He wanted everyone to know their role in society, pay their taxes to the church and to him, and pray the right time, preferably under a roof he had personally authorized. It wasn't perfect. Corruption was still a problem. Communication was slow, and sometimes local lords ignored orders when no one was watching. But for a man in charge of a territory stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, it worked surprisingly well. By the early 800s, Charlemagne's empire was the largest in Europe since the fall of Rome. His territory was huge, stretching from modern-day France and Germany to northern Italy and parts of Central Europe. It included many different cultures, languages, and weather patterns, which could make it very cold in July. The man ruled over Catholics, pagans, tribes that were half Christian, ambitious nobles, and moody bishops. And somehow he managed to keep them all in order. At first, things seemed great. The Carolingian Renaissance was happening. Monasteries were copying books like caffeinated scribes. The law and order system was roughly the same everywhere. Charlemagne's face was even printed on coins, looking stern from the side. This doesn't really make you think, I'm in charge. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were starting to appear. First of all, there's the issue of who will take over. Charlemagne had many children, at least 18, thanks to a rotating cast of wives and mistresses, but only a few were considered politically viable. He had once divided the empire among 3 sons, just like his father had. Then one died, then another. By 806, he only had 1 heir left, Louis the Pious, the youngest and, well, the most monk-like. Louis was a good Christian. He was quiet and thoughtful and kind. Put simply, he's the complete opposite of Charlemagne. When your empire relies on intimidation and strong-willed determination, it feels risky to hand it over to someone who prefers religious songs to politics. Then there was the nobility. During Charlemagne's rule, they were kept under control by fear and because they were very efficient. But even then, local counts were getting bolder. Some people were happy to follow royal laws. Others treated them like polite suggestions. The empire was stable, but it was a personality cult held together by one man and very few backup systems. Add to that the never-ending wars, constant rebellions, especially from the Saxons, who had not yet been completely defeated, and the cost of maintaining armies, and you can see why there was mounting pressure. Even the church, while mostly loyal, had its own ambitions. Bishops had political power. Abbots was in charge of a huge area of land. They agreed with Charlemagne's rule in some ways, but not in all ways. They sometimes disagreed, especially when the king's demands were against the rules of war or the rules about money for monasteries. The empire was brilliant, but like all things built too quickly and on a large scale, it depended on the one person who could command it all. And that person was getting old. In the winter of 814, Charlemagne got sick. He was in Archon, his favorite palace city, with scholars, advisors, and the smell of burned firewood and ink-stained parchment still in the air. He was 72, which was very good for a man who had spent decades fighting wars, crossing mountains, and making sure that all the nobles knew who was in charge. Even though he looked like a warrior, he was in decline, but very slowly and without anyone noticing. He didn't eat and prayed. Einhard, the man who wrote his biography, said that he died calmly and with the dignity you would expect from a Christian emperor. On January 28th, at 8:14 a.m., Charlemagne died. The bells rang. The empire held its breath. They buried him in Archon Cathedral beneath a marble throne. He was wrapped in imperial robes, with a sword at his side and a copy of the Gospels on his lap. It was a pretty good send-off for a man who had once been made emperor of the Romans in a surprise ceremony. Later, stories were made up about him. They said he sat upright in his tomb like a sleeping king. They said he was ready to rise again if the empire ever needed him. It was obviously just a love story. But he told his only surviving son, Louis, who was religious, that he had inherited the whole empire, including its difficult borders, rebellious nobles, and growing unrest. Louis tried to rule well. He really did. But he wasn't his dad. The stronghold on power was lost, and civil wars broke out. In a few decades, the large empire that Charlemagne had built was split into smaller parts, and this led to the creation of France and Germany as separate kingdoms. But Charlemagne's legacy is still around today, even though his empire no longer exists. It grew. He became a legendary figure, Carolus Magnus, the perfect Christian king. Popes remembered him. Emperors styled themselves in his image. The Holy Roman Empire, which was founded long after his death, considered him their spiritual father. Even Napoleon, hundreds of years later, copied Charlemagne's coronation to get some of that old royal glow. Charlemagne didn't just make Europe one country. He created a plan that combined Roman law, Germanic kingship, and Christian faith. He helped rebuild the continent after the Dark Ages and laid the foundations for the nations that would come to define it. When he died, the world lost a man, but it gained a legend. And as Europe showed time and time again, legends are much harder to forget. A medieval feast was about more than just eating. It was about being seen. Picture this. There are long wooden tables covered in cloth, flickering torches that cast shadows on stone walls, and the smell of roasted meat mixing with wine, sweat, and ambition. This wasn't dinner. This was theater. Everything about the food, the seating, and the amounts served was planned as part of social ritual. In a world where birth decided your rank, feasts let the ruling class remind everyone of their place. The seating arrangements were a political move. The lord and lady sat at the high table, which was higher than the other tables. They were both important and powerful. The closer you sat to them, the more important you were. If you found yourself sitting next to the musicians and feeling cold, you weren't just feeling the cold, you felt unwanted. Food arrived in waves, which they called removes. The first course might feature stuffed peacocks, with their feathers reattached for a fancy look. Then came plates of venison, swan, pigeon pies, and boar's heads with apples in their mouths. Nothing subtle. If the animal once had a face, it was likely staring back at you now, covered in wine sauce. And then there were the small details. Beautiful edible sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, or pastry. These were shaped into castles, saints, mythical creatures, or scenes from well-known stories from the Bible. These weren't meant to be eaten. People were meant to admire or gaze at them, or both. But it wasn't just about showing off how rich they were. Feasts were political tools. Treaties were negotiated while they were eating pheasant. People got together and made their friendship stronger over glasses of spiced wine. People got married after their meals. If you have a bad feast, people might think badly of you. It's a great event that could make people loyal for years to come. Even when he was silent, he was still communicating something. Guests weren't just allowed to speak freely. The toasts were timed. Music started conversations. A juggler might perform to distract from a boring moment. A poet might say things that are so flattering they make the person seem boring. A grand medieval feast was always a bit of a mess. The castle kitchen, not your cozy modern space with its ceramic countertops and herb gardens. No, this was a smoky, noisy, wood-fired war zone run by a big, intimidating group of people. At the top of this culinary command tower stood the master cook, the Gordon Ramsay of his day, minus the swearing, or with more swearing in Latin. He was in charge of many assistants, spit turners, pot boys, pastry makers, fish cleaners, saucemen, and one poor person whose job was just plucking poultry all day. They weren't making 2 or 3 different dishes. They were making hundreds of them, often without a single written recipe, because cookbooks were rare, handwritten, and kept very safely. The kitchen fire burned all the time. There were no thermostats, just very hot hands, guesswork, and prayer. Large pieces of meat were hung on long sticks over a fire. The meat was turned over by young boys whose arms were always moving. The size of the meat was also impressive. It's like a 3-day feast where the cow might turn up in pieces. Sauces were very important. Everything was covered in a mixture of vinegar, wine, and unusual spices. It's not because they were trying to hide rotten food, like the myth says. That would have offended the guests. But because spices were seen as a sign of wealth, things like saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were imported luxuries. Serving them wasn't just about flavor. It was about using trade connections to get what you want. This chicken tastes like cinnamon, which is basically medieval for me. Bread was a staple food, but there were different types. The nobility got the fancy white bread. The servants ate the harder brown bread, and under every dish was a trench. This was a stale piece of bread used as a plate which soaked up all the greasy juices. It was then either eaten by the lower classes or thrown to the dogs, or both, depending on the dog's manners. It smelt of herbs, meat, yeast, sweat, and fire. The noise, the constant clanging, shouting, and the occasional panicked squawk from a goose that hadn't yet accepted what was going to happen. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient, and without it, the whole idea that upstairs was effortless and noble would have fallen apart. If you ever got invited to a medieval feast, congratulations. You were either important, rich, or someone's political target. But what did you actually end up eating? If you're a picky eater, you might want to look away. The meat was the most important thing on the table. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, geese, swans, and even porcupines. If you were dining on a particularly unusual coastline, anything that could walk, fly, swim, or vaguely resemble meat was fair game. Hunting was both a sport and a way of supplying food. Nobles went out and killed the food that they would later talk about while they were eating it. And the rarer the animal, the higher its status. The most exciting part was when whole roasted animals were brought out. Picture a whole pig with its snout polished, teeth bared, and an apple in its mouth, or a swan with its feathers reapplied after cooking to make it look nice. If it looked dangerous before, it was supposed to look majestic now. But it wasn't just about how many people were involved. The menu was carefully designed. You didn't put everything on the table at once. You served it in courses called removes. The first might include light meals, soups, small pies, and fish if it was Friday, as long as the church was watching. Later courses included more meat, roasts, game, pies stuffed with meat and spice, and more meat. Fish was a popular food, especially during times when people were not allowed to eat. Eels, pike, and herring often visited. Sometimes they were shaped like animals, but they were definitely not. Why serve boring boiled fish when you can serve a fish that looks like a hedgehog? And what about the spices? Oh, the spices. In the Middle Ages, people did not believe in bland. What do you think about cinnamon on chicken? Absolutely. Ginger and gravy, of course. Is sugar on meat okay? Why not? Sweet and savory tastes lived happily together, sometimes on the same bite. Vegetables, on the other hand, were not often eaten. People used to think that root vegetables and greens were for poor people, and that they were too plain and too earthy. Lords didn't like turnips unless they were stuffed into a pastry shaped like a unicorn. By the time the feast was over, the menu had changed from simple to showy. The goal wasn't to stop people feeling hungry. The idea was to impress your guests so much that they would be full, amazed, and maybe even a little bit scared of the next room. Because dessert might just be breathing fire. While the food was designed to make people fat and show off how rich the king was, a medieval feast also had to have lots of entertainment. You didn't just eat. You laughed, listened, looked on in amazement, and sometimes winced at whatever happened between courses. Enter the fool, the court jester, wearing bells, clothes that don't match, and having the confidence to insult the host without worrying about getting killed. Usually, the fool's job was to make people laugh, make fun of the powerful, and create a sense of order out of chaos. They juggled, told stories, and did slapstick routines. They did this very skillfully. They knew that one bad joke could get them fired or killed. Then the minstrels arrived with their treasures, harps, and voices trained in ballads about love, war, and sometimes dragons. The hall was filled with music, which was a key part of the experience, rather than just a background noise. These songs weren't just for a certain mood. They were political commentaries, historical records, and flattery, but they were disguised as music. If the lord of the house was the hero in the third verse, the minstrel would have a good meal that night. If you wanted something more exciting, you could have acrobats and fire breathers. Yes, it was real fire. It's an indoor setting in a wooden hall with rushes and tapestries on the walls. Safety codes were a long way off. Sword swallowers, animal tamers, and dancing bears performed, though the bears weren't always happy about it. And then there were the subtleties, edible performances, sugar sculptures that also made fun of politics. There are giant pies with real birds inside, released mid-course for dramatic effect. We were not rich, as we could tell from the doves that exploded out of the pie when we cut into it. The guests applauded politely and tried not to get pooped on. Some of these feasts included morality plays, which were short plays about being good or bad. These were performed by traveling theater groups or sometimes by monks who were so excited that they played the devil. Everything was planned. The entertainment made everyone feel good, took our minds off the politics, and made sure that no one felt like complaining about anything. A good entertainer could stop a duel from happening. A bad one might start one. At a medieval feast, you weren't just watching a show, you were the star of the show. And the laughter was just another way to make sure everyone was focused on the host and not the knives. In medieval times, it was more important to eat with other people than to eat certain foods. A feast was like a medieval version of a press conference, a marriage proposal, a court negotiation, and a corporate takeover, all rolled into one big, greasy event. Hosting a feast wasn't just about being friendly. It was a strategy. It was a sign of wealth, power, generosity, and control. Every detail, from where the seats are to how the information is shared, was clearly explained. Take seating, for example. The high table wasn't just physically elevated. It was very unpopular. The lord and lady sat in the middle, with their most important guests, bishops, foreign ambassadors, and visiting nobles on either side of them. If you were anywhere near the salt cellar, you were somebody. Everyone else was just happy to be alive. That's where we get the term above the salt. You were either close to the host and important people, or seated near the floor with the musicians and empty wine glasses. Invitations weren't handed out everywhere. If someone was invited to a feast, it showed that they were important. If you didn't go, it was a sign that you didn't care. That was a statement. It might make armed men come to your house and ask why your chair was empty. On the other hand, going to the feast of arrival could mean you were switching sides. Every guest list was a political problem. The food itself carried messages. Serving a special food from the area could make a visiting duke happy. There was so much game that it meant, look how big and well-stocked my lands are, including foreign spices. I have trade connections that you only dream about. Even wine could have a special meaning. Was it local, imported, or blessed by a bishop? Then there were the gifts. Guests were expected to bring gifts, such as jewels or valuable items, and to speak highly of the host in return. Toasts were a mix of flattery, performance, and sometimes a warning. Feasts were also the time when people would make agreements to work together. A marriage could be arranged over honeyed quail. The problem of who owns the land was solved by the third remove. And if all else failed, a rival lord could be made drunk enough to sign something stupid or too poisoned to wake up the next morning. Even though medieval feasts were very big and fancy, they were still controlled by the church, an organization that even kings had to follow. The church had strong opinions about what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how guilty you should feel afterwards. In a medieval calendar, there were more fasting days than feasting days. That's not an exaggeration. Almost half the year was spent on a special diet. We were there on Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent and Advent, as well as on various nights when there was no service. On these days, they would not eat meat from land animals. So, how did the nobles manage? They were still creative and threw great parties. They just swapped out ingredients. We stopped eating beef, pork, and venison. Fish, eggs, almonds, and anything else that could be considered non-meat items were introduced. Beaver tails, for example, were considered fish because they were scaly and lived in water. The problem's been solved. God's fine with loopholes, right? Dishes became like a performance by a skilled acrobat. Chefs made imitation cheese from almond milk. They turned fish into fake roasts. Some meals looked like sin, but they were technically okay. And of course, wine wasn't considered food. It never does. Not on feast days when we celebrate saints or holy events. But it was open season, and the church held its own festivals too. Easter, Christmas, and Epiphany. These weren't just sacred. They were the perfect reasons to eat everything in sight. A Christmas feast might last for 12 whole days, with each course bigger and more ridiculous than the last. There's nothing more appropriate for the celebration of the birth of Christ than a pie with 4 different types of bird inside. Monasteries weren't exempt either. Although monks were supposed to live simply, some abbots became famous for their kitchens. A rich monastery might have oysters and spiced eel for lunch. Monks developed precise food schedules, including seasonal menus and substitutions that kept them full and their sins technical. But food was still a spiritual thing. Eating and drinking too much wasn't just about enjoying yourself. It was a great performance. You said thank you before you ate, gave money to the church afterwards, and prayed that your cook hadn't served you meat on the wrong Thursday. In medieval times, being too hungry was a sin. But eating with people who are very religious was almost like a religious ceremony. Medieval feasts were not like today's free-for-alls. There were lots of rules. Actually, if you wanted to keep your position and your seat, you had to act like a proper nobleman. The first rule is simple: don't touch the food like a peasant. At that time, forks weren't used very often, so people mostly ate with their fingers. But there was a system to it. You used the first 3 fingers of your right hand, but never your left. Otherwise, people might have said you were a witch or that you didn't keep your hands clean. Second, don't lick your fingers until the meal is over. It was common to wash your hands in a shared basin between courses, but licking them during dinner was seen as very poor manners. Each guest had their own knife, which they brought with them. Your host didn't provide cutlery, just food and a place to put it. Your knife was for more than just cutting. It was a personal statement, like a medieval iPhone. It has a fancy handle. You're important. The blade is rusty. Enjoy sitting by the firewood. The rules about drinking were a bit of battle. You didn't just drink your wine quickly. You toasted. You drank a little. You offered your neighbor the cup, especially if you wanted them to do you a favor or if you wanted to politely challenge them to a duel later. And yes, you shared goblets. At that time, the idea of germs had not been discovered yet. Because everyone was often dying from plague, they did not think about whether or not they touched their lips. Then there was conversation. You were expected to talk, but not too much. Have a laugh, but don't make too much noise. Say nice things about the food, but don't praise the host more. Don't talk while you're eating unless you're trying to insult someone. Also, don't burp unless you're Mongolian, drunk, or both. At fancy meals, hand washing was almost a ceremonial gesture. Servants poured scented water over guests' hands. They did this before the first course and again before dessert. This was not to make sure everyone was clean. It was to show how fancy the guests were. Etiquette wasn't about being polite. It was about showing you belonged. One small mistake, a little spilled wine, a sleeve that got dirty, reaching too far across the table, and suddenly you weren't eating with important people. You were back with the dogs, and they didn't share the wine. After the last swan was carved, the final toast was delivered, and the fool was escorted out to juggle bread rolls into a bishop's goblet. One question remained. What happened to the food? Medieval feasts produced a lot of it. Bourse, pies, jellied fish, sugar castles, and bread soaked in meat drippings. It was more than even the hungriest noble could eat. But even waste was a luxury. The food you didn't eat sent the same message as the food you did eat. So what happened to it? If you were lucky, it would go to the servants. They ate in shifts after the feast, picking over what remained from the lower tables. Sometimes they would get the best cuts of meat, especially if a guest they really liked gave them their roast meat or decided not to eat the stuffed hedgehog pastry. It wasn't fancy, but it was better than porridge. The trencher bread, which is a thick slice of bread that you can use as a plate, was different. It was full of sauces and grease, and nobles only ate it when they were really drunk. Instead, These soggy slabs were collected and often given to poor people. And it's not out of charity, mind you. It was more like nobles saying, "Here, have the rest of what we used to be." But if you were a peasant, getting a slab of spiced boar fat was better than a sermon on humility. In monasteries and churches, people used the leftover food from feasts as ammunition. It was expected that people would feed the poor. Leftovers were gathered into baskets, blessed, probably after the fingers were picked out, and handed out as a moral duty. Sometimes, the poor were even invited to eat in the great hall after the nobles had left, but they sat in a very different place, and usually without the juggling bear. But not everything was eaten by people who were hungry. Some of it was thrown away, given to pigs to eat, or used to make compost. Why? In medieval high society, restraint was not important. Having more than you need of something made you look rich. Allowing food to go to waste behind the kitchen door was just part of the show. The nobles got over their drunkenness and felt pleased with themselves for a good time they had had. But for the rest of the people, life continued as normal. Servants eating bones, ordinary people waiting in line for holes to dig, and dogs fighting over dead fish. In medieval times, even leftovers were organized into a hierarchy. The candles had burned low. The musicians were snoring under the benches. Half the guests were covered in pie crusts, and the other half were finding their shoes or dignity in the castle corridors. The feast was over, but the next morning, everything changed. Cleaning up started before the guests had even left. The servants worked quickly, getting rid of bones, digging trenches, and sweeping the floor clean. Those sweet-smelling herbs were scattered to mask the smell of sweat, spilled wine, and noble flatulence. Rushes had to be replaced often, especially after a big meal, when the floor got more than just crumbs on it. And then came the reckoning. The steward, who was basically the party planner in medieval times, checked the damage. Broken glasses, missing cutlery, and a lot of gravy near the bishop's seat. Everything was included in the report. Sometimes guests even stole cutlery as a weird badge of honor. If you left with a spoon, it meant you were important enough to dare. The kitchen was a mess. Pots that had been burned, plates that had been cracked, and a lot of grease. The cooks came out of the kitchen looking like survivors. Some of them had lost an eyebrow in the fire, and some of them were complaining that next time they would just serve porridge. For the host, though, the real work had just begun. I started thinking about the politics of gratitude. Letters were written, gifts were sent, compliments were paid. If a guest of importance wasn't properly thanked, or worse, if they were seated too far from the roast swan, they might not be happy. In the Middle Ages, people often kept grudges that eventually led to feuds or wars. Sometimes a feast went wrong, a guest was rude, an alliance was offended, or a drunken nobleman admitted to planning a coup while drunk. One careless toast could ruin months of diplomacy. The feast was a show, but like all theater, the reviews could be very negative. For the poor people, the next day was normal. Some people washed the dishes, and some people cleared away the rubbish. Some were lucky and found a forgotten piece of almond cake behind the desk. That was breakfast. And then, quietly, the castle started to function again. The banners were taken down, the dogs were fed, and the torches were put out until the next celebration, coronation, or wedding, or any other time they wanted to impress the neighbors. The feasting season was over, but its effects could still be seen and felt. In medieval times, people remembered what they ate, whether it was good or bad. Lou Erickson was not born quietly. He was born around the year 970, somewhere in Iceland or Greenland, depending on which story you believe. He was born into a family of people who had left their country, who were ambitious, and who had a lot of self-control issues. His father was Eric the Red, a Norwegian criminal who was sent into exile for murder. He later got exiled again from Iceland for, shockingly, more murder. Instead of learning self-control, Eric discovered Greenland. If you're banned from one frozen island, you might as well claim another one. Leif grew up in a remote, tough community where winters were very cold, there were not many neighbors, and the only thing that was always traded were stories. Greenland wasn't a successful colony. It was barely a working base, kept going by people's determination, bits of wood and fish. But it gave Leif something that mattered more than comfort and perspective. He knew what it was like to survive in a place that was very far from anywhere. His family had long followed Norse traditions. They liked to have a lot of alcohol, were always ready for a fight, and never trusted people in charge. But even in this tough culture, Leif was different. He was curious, thoughtful, and observant. The sagas say he was tall, strong, handsome, and much more thoughtful than his unpredictable father. He didn't grow up studying scrolls or being taught by scholars. He grew up listening to stories about gods, monsters, adventures, and getting revenge. These stories weren't for bedtime. They were survival manuals wrapped in mythology, and they had a strong effect on Leif. Greenland was isolated, and young Leif was hungry for more. Leif was different from his father. His father wanted power and ended up being forced to leave his country and fight a war. Leif wanted to explore the world. He wanted to go to Iceland, Norway, and other countries. He listened to old sailors talk about strange lands beyond the ice. He studied the stars and watched the tides. By the time he reached manhood, he wasn't just the son of Eric the Red. He was a Norse man with a boat, a brain, and a burning need to explore. Anything that wasn't a freezing rock filled with equally frozen egos. Before he ever sailed west, before the church came calling, before his name landed in sagas and schoolbooks, Leif Erikson was a boy born of fire and ice, destined to outrun both. Leif didn't just drift into greatness, he sailed into it. At some point in his early adulthood, Leif left Greenland and traveled to Norway, the old heart of Norse power. It was more than just a homecoming. It was a meeting with a world that was much more advanced, organized, and surprisingly religious. Norway wasn't the same place his father had fled. King Olaf Tryggvason was now in charge. He had a crown and a sword, and he really wanted to convert the Norse to Christianity, even if they didn't want to. Leif met Olaf, a Christian warrior king who had replaced the old ways of blood feuds with baptisms and long ships with churches. And unlike many of his fellow countrymen, Leif didn't laugh. He listened. Maybe it was just diplomacy. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe Leif had grown tired of the never-ending cycle of raids, revenge, and gods who mostly demanded blood and beer. Whatever the reason, Leif was baptized, accepted Christianity, and was given a new mission: bring the faith back to Greenland. It wasn't an easy task. Try to imagine how it would be to try to explain the idea of there being only one God to a group of farmers who regularly sacrificed goats to Thor when the weather was strange. Greenland was remote, suspicious of outsiders, and still mostly loyal to Odin, Freya, and the rest of the Thunder-Happy crew. But Leif didn't come back empty-handed. He brought priests, knowledge, and royal support. When he arrived in Greenland again, he wasn't just the son of a chieftain. He was a messenger for a king and a new god. And while he didn't immediately bring about a big change, his influence began to take root. Christianity started as a small group of people. Chapels were built. People put up crosses. The old gods weren't replaced immediately, but they had serious competition. This was a big change. Leif was no longer just a sailor or settler. He was a cultural bridge, a man between two worlds: Norse tradition and Christian order, pagan legend and written law. He was a mix of Norse and Jewish beliefs. And while he was busy with all that, Leif Erikson started hearing stories about strange lands to the west. The land is full of grapes, with forests and no snow. The next great voyage was coming up. Some of the best discoveries start with a dream. Others start with poor navigation. Leif Erikson had set sail from Norway with a good reason. He wanted to spread Christianity to Greenland and also to visit his family. But fate, or maybe the North Atlantic's moody weather, had other ideas. According to the Greenlander's story, Leif heard whispers of a strange land far west. This land had been seen years earlier by a man named Bjarni Herolfsson, who had glimpsed unknown shores but never bothered to land. Classic Bjarni was a man who discovered North America and then just kept sailing like he had groceries in the back. But Leif was made of different wood. In the year 1000, he bought Bonnie's ship, got a crew together, and decided to find out what was over the horizon. He was venturing into the unknown. He was becoming a legend. The journey was dangerous. Icebergs, storms, and the very real risk of falling off the edge of the earth made things interesting. But Leif was calm and steady, and, as the old stories say, he was very good at his job. Eventually, his ship reached a place that was very different from Greenland. First came a land that had no trees or plants, which he named Helland, probably the same as Baffin Island today. It was flat, rocky, and not very interesting. Then came Markland, probably Labrador, where there were forests thick enough to build a whole fleet of ships. It's useful, but not quite as good as it was supposed to be. Finally, Leif arrived at a place so mild and with so many resources that his crew named it Finland, the land of wine, or grapes, or possibly fermented berries. The sagas are vague, and Norsemen weren't exactly experts on wine. No matter what, the place was like heaven compared to the icy, horrible place they called home. They built houses, explored rivers, and enjoyed not having to get their drinking water from a glacier. Leif called the main settlement Leifsbuda, Leif's Booths, a simple name for a man who made history by accident. He stayed there through the winter, mapping the land, gathering timber, and preparing stories that would shake the North once he returned. There were no big battles or wars, just small groups of people exploring in a practical way. It's surprisingly modern for a Viking. Leif didn't plant flags or say who it was his. He just watched, pointed it out, and left. But he did this, and he was the first person from Europe to set foot in North America. Before Columbus, before anyone had made any maps, and before anyone knew what he'd done, Leif Erikson's landing in Vinland should have been the start of a new golden age for the Norse. The weather is mild, the grapes are wild, and there are tall trees. You won't get frostbite. What more could a person from Greenland ask for? But paradise, as it turns out, comes with problems, especially when you don't ask the locals if they mind visitors. The sagas tell us that Leif and his crew spent a winter in Vinland building huts and gathering valuable resources. They found wheat that grew by itself, huge forests, and enough fish to feed a group of warriors. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a solution. Greenland was cold, empty, and far away from other places. Vinland was a pleasant place with lots of potential. But Leif didn't settle there. He didn't claim it for the king, didn't build a church, and didn't bring a second group of settlers. He simply went back to Greenland with a cargo hold full of wood and a story no one could believe was real. Why? The sagas don't say much, but what came next suggests that Leif knew Vinland wasn't empty. Later, Norse expeditions led by his brother Thorvald, his sister Freydis, and others had violent encounters with the indigenous peoples they called Skrælings. We still don't know who these people were, but they might have been ancestors of the modern-day Micmac, Beothuk, or Inuit. It's obvious that they weren't happy about heavily armed strangers turning up with axes and acting like they owned the place. Although there was no fighting in Leif's expedition, he may have felt that they should not have taken this land. He didn't try to conquer them. He didn't set fire to villages. He didn't leave behind a lot of dead bodies or destroyed churches. Instead, he left quietly, The Norse people would remember Vinland for many years. A land so close, so full of possibilities, yet out of reach. Later voyages tried to settle it, but there was a lot of tension with the native peoples. It was very far from anywhere, and it was dangerous to go any further, so the idea was never put into practice. In the end, Leif's discovery was too early. The Norse world wasn't ready for them. The ocean was too big, the politics too weak, and there were too few settlers. Vinland became a legend, like part of Eden and part ghost. And there was Leif. He went back to Greenland, but not as a winner or a winner's prize. He went back as a man who had seen something that no one else had seen. A world waiting just not for them. When Leif Erikson returned from Vinland, he didn't come home with gold or fame. He introduced a religion called Christianity, which was much more controversial. Back in Norway, Leif had been baptized under the orders of King Olaf Tryggs, who saw the sword and the cross as equally valid tools for building a nation. Leif had accepted the new religion calmly and thoughtfully, without making a big deal out of it. But now, with a royal commission and a ship full of priests, he arrived in Greenland to explore and spread the Christian faith. But Greenland hadn't changed while he was away. The colony was still mostly made up of Norse pagans. The people still carved runes, Old Norse writing, drank to Odin, and said prayers to Thor during snowstorms. They were settlers, survivors, practical and traditional. They did not trust a religion that said all their gods were false and that drinking blood at the winter solstice might be wrong. Leif didn't destroy temples or burn idols. That wasn't the way he usually played. Instead, he used diplomacy, generosity, and the support of the royal family. He built a church, which is said to have been the first in Greenland. He gave shelter to priests. He spoke to the chiefs and told them stories. He told them stories about Christ, but also about a better world, a world without ice and without people being forced to leave their homes. His own mother, Theodhild, converted and built a chapel of her own. His father, Eric the Red, famously refused. Eric didn't like this new god. He didn't enjoy blood sacrifices and didn't fight with a hammer. For Eric, Christianity was a sign of weakness. For Leif, it was a way forward. This division within the family was similar to the larger split in Greenland. Some people accepted the new religion, thinking it was a step forward, a way to be protected, or a way to get the king's favor. Others rejected it as foreign noise. People who were open to change and people who preferred to stick to tradition both felt the same things. Leif didn't force change. He was the perfect example of this. He lived as both a Norse and a Christian, a seafarer and a settler. His quiet strength made him a symbol of faith and balance. He didn't kill the old gods. He just stopped calling on them. For a colony on the edge of the world, his example was enough to start something new, even if it took a long time to grow. Leif Erikson may have made his own history across the North Atlantic, but he did so during a time of great conflict. His father, Eric the Red, was infamous. He was a legendary fighter and settler. He was exiled from Norway and Iceland, and then he founded Greenland just to have somewhere new to be kicked out of. Wherever he went, Lorman cringed, and neighbors kept their axes close. He was known for his temper, and even more so for his charisma. Growing up with Eric was difficult. Leif had to find a balance between being bold and being reckless, being a good leader and being crazy. Where Eric was fire, Leif was frost. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone, but people still followed him. The Greenlanders respected his calm. He didn't conquer with a sword, but with leadership, and that might have been just what the colony needed. But the comparison never stopped. Leif came back for Vineland with timber and tales, not gold. Eric's Christian mission in Greenland spread slowly, while he sulked and scoffed. The old man had wanted a warrior son to continue his brutal legacy. Instead, he got an explorer, a believer, someone who used diplomacy more than force. Some people saw this as a sign of weakness, while others saw it as a sign of wisdom. Leif didn't care. He wasn't trying to be better than Eric. He was just getting by. When Eric the Red died, some say it was from an illness. Others say it was a slow defeat of spirit. This was the end of a particular way of life for the Norsemen. Eric was associated with the world of old gods, exile, and explosive pride. Leif was different, representing a future that went beyond the icy fjords and blood feuds of the past. In the sagas, their relationship feels tense. Eric is jealous of Leif's new religion. Leif tries to convert him. Neither bends, but there's also a sense of respect and even admiration. Eric knew his son was very different from him. Maybe deep down, he was happy about it. Leif never became king. He never used force to rule, but he outlived his father in terms of religion and history. He started a new era for Greenland. It may be less dramatic, but it is more sustainable. Sometimes being great doesn't mean dealing with your dad's problems. Sometimes it's about refusing to take on their problems. After Vinland, after the church building, and after Eric the Red died, Leif Erikson didn't try to achieve any more glory. He didn't set off on another expedition or try to conquer new lands. He did something that was the opposite of what a Viking would do. He never left his home again. Leif lived in Brattahlid, Greenland, a settlement his father had built. But while Eric ruled with an authoritarian style, Leif was more relaxed. He became chief, but more than that, he became a symbol, and a symbol of something positive. Continuity and quiet leadership in a world that was beginning to change. We don't know much about the later years. The stories become less clear. His name is less important in the story, but it is still there. He is still respected and remembered, but he is no longer at the center of the storm. He raised a family. His son, Thorleifson, would one day lead Greenland. Christianity spread slowly but steadily. The colony continued, but Vineland, the place that should have changed everything, didn't. Others tried to do the same. His brother Thorvald sailed west and was killed by the native people there. His sister Freydis went on an adventure that was full of danger, violence, and poor choices. All attempts to settle in Vinland failed, not because the land was lacking, but because the Norse world wasn't ready. They are far away, they are unfriendly, and they don't give much support. Leif knew that there were risks. That's why he didn't come back. He had shown that the journey could be made. He had seen what was on the other side of the sea, but he also knew that Greenland needed stability more than it needed brave acts. Over time, stories about Vinland became legends. It's half memory and half dream. Some people believed it, others didn't. But Leif never shouted about his discovery from the top of a mountain. He never asked for any recognition or asked for songs. He didn't need them because he understood something rare. Sometimes to make history, you have to know when to wait. He probably spent his final days watching the sea and remembering the voyage that no one thought would be possible. As far as we know, he died in Greenland peacefully, not on a battlefield, not on a ship, just at home. Leif Erikson, the explorer who traveled further than any other Norse person before him, died not chasing the horizon, but helping others to do so. Leif Erikson may have had a quiet life, but people still remember him today. It changed, traveled, and multiplied, carried not by historians, but by storytellers. And storytellers, as we know, aren't very good at sticking to facts. The main sources for Leif's life, the Greenlander's story and the Eric the Red saga, were written 200 years after he lived. It's like trying to write a biography of Napoleon based on your great-great-grandfather's fishing stories. They're full of drama, with lots of detail, and they seem too easy. One story makes Leif look like a kind of Viking missionary spreading Christianity, calm like a Norse saint. Another shows him as a brave explorer who accidentally ends up in North America. Other people add extra stories to make the tale more interesting. And then there's Freudis, his sister. She is sometimes described as a fierce warrior woman. She chased off attackers while she was heavily pregnant. She was screaming and slapping a sword across her bare chest. Is it true? Maybe not. But would you want to fight her? Definitely not. What's interesting is how the sagas mix truth and legend together in a way you can't separate. Leif wasn't one to boast, but the more people told his story, the louder it grew. Over time, he came to be seen as a symbol of adventure, faith, and resilience. He was a Norseman who was one of the first to sail west. And then he disappeared again, hidden under layers of dust, forgotten because of other people who were more famous. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that people started to take an interest in Leif again. Historians were eager to find a European who had reached America before Columbus. Then, statues suddenly appeared. Streets were named. A National Ericsson Day was declared in the United States. The 9th of October is based on nothing more than immigration paperwork. Leif would have hated all the attention. He wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't trying to make a big deal out of it. He was just doing what Norsemen had always done. He went sailing into the unknown and brought back what he could. But history had other ideas. The quiet Greenlander who left no books, no speeches, and no boasts is remembered as the man who discovered a continent, even if he never claimed it. Leif Erikson never built an empire. He didn't fight in major battles. He didn't rule a kingdom or wear a golden crown. He has endured, not because he demanded a place in history, but because he quietly earned it. While others chased fame through fire and blood, Leif sailed west into the unknown, guided by curiosity, not war. He didn't call himself a hero or a saint. He didn't build monuments. He didn't try to hold on to the land he found. He just went, saw, and came back. He was a rare explorer who didn't need to be famous to be a good explorer. And it did. People still tell stories about Leif today. These stories are passed down over many centuries and have been changed by different storytellers, from bards to poets and politicians. The boy from Greenland is a symbol of exploration, resilience, and quiet strength. His journey to Vinland is part of the Norse epic, a story about a people who dared to sail past the edge of the known world, looking for new opportunities, not for war. In the modern age, Leif has been reborn. Statues of him can be found in Boston, Seattle, Trondheim, and Reykjavik. He's shown as a proud Norse man looking west, with his hand on his forehead as if he's still looking out to sea for the shore with the trees on it. Schools are named after him. Ships are no different. And every October 9th, a few people in America even remember that he was almost 500 years ahead of Columbus. But perhaps the most important thing he did wasn't about discovery or distance. It's about finding a balance. He was caught between two worlds, paganism and Christianity, chaos and order, the old gods and a new faith. He didn't force change. He was the perfect example of this. He led without shouting. He converted without trying to convert others. He showed that you don't always have to be loud to be brave, and that sometimes it's better to just do the right thing and go home quietly. Leif Erikson never asked to be remembered, but in a world that often thinks that noise is a sign of greatness, his story reminds us that legends aren't always made in fire.